In a chamber built on power and pride, it wasn't a law or a vote that shattered the silence. It was Jasmine Crockett's story, and Cory Booker's voice carried it into history. The Senate is no stranger to speeches, but this was different. As Booker rose, the usual shuffle of papers and half-hearted glances slowed to a crawl. His eyes scanned the room, his chest lifted with resolve, and then his words struck. What you've endured, what you've risen from is nothing short of extraordinary. The weight of that sentence hung in the air. It wasn't just political praise. It was a confession, an unveiling of truth long ignored. Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had been mocked, underestimated, and pushed to the margins, now stood as the embodiment of resilience. And on this day, her story was being carved into the record of the Senate itself. Some senators looked away, their discomfort plain. Vulnerability had no place here, or so they thought. Yet others leaned forward, their expressions softening, caught in the rare electricity of sincerity. Booker's voice trembled, not with weakness, but with a depth of conviction that pulled the chamber into a silence it could not escape. He was not delivering a speech for headlines. He was laying bare a truth that demanded recognition. Crockett's presence was not luck, not tokenism, not accident. It was survival turned into service. Every challenge she had faced, every dismissal she had endured, was now reframed as proof that this chamber, this very nation, still had a heartbeat worth fighting for. Jasmine Crockett, Booker declared, is not here because the system made space for her. She is here because she forced the doors open and carried the weight of every silenced voice with her. That is not just politics. That is America at its most honest. The chamber froze. For a moment, even the walls seemed to lean in, straining to absorb the magnitude of his words. And beneath it all, a question simmered. What story could make a senator's voice crack? Could move even the most hardened lawmakers to listen? Because what came next was not applause, not ritual, not routine. It was the unveiling of a journey so raw, so undeniable, that would leave the entire Senate shaken, and America watching in disbelief. And to understand why Cory Booker's tribute carried such force, we must revisit the very forces that tried to stop Jasmine Crockett from ever standing in that chamber at all. The Senate is not built for moments of vulnerability. Its marble floors and towering ceilings were designed to project permanence, authority, and detachment. Here, emotion is often treated as weakness, and stories of struggle are drowned beneath procedural votes and hollow speeches. Yet, on this day, something shifted. Cory Booker had cracked the chamber's armor, but the power of his words came from more than his delivery. It came from the way of the story he was about to reveal. Why did this moment matter? Because in the United States Senate, acknowledgement is currency. To be seen, to have your story recognized in that arena, is to have it etched into the national consciousness. Jasmine Crockett's journey was not supposed to be spoken here. Not in a chamber where too many had dismissed her, laughed at her, or whispered about her behind closed doors. For some, her very presence was an affront, a challenge to the status quo. And that is why Booker's tribute was so radical. By lifting her story above the noise, he was forcing America's power brokers to confront what they preferred to ignore. That resilience born from struggle is more American than any empty slogan. Imagine the contrast. On one side, the faces of senators who thrived in systems built to favor them, systems that bent rules in their favor, systems that treated privilege as destiny. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, who had clawed her way into the chamber, not because doors were opened, but because she broke through when those doors were locked. Booker's voice wasn't just honoring her, it was exposing them. You sit here, he said, his voice steady, believing that power is inherited. But Jasmine's power was earned. In the courtrooms, in the streets, in the places this chamber forgets until election season. Gasps followed, not because the truth was unknown, but because it was finally being spoken aloud. For viewers at home, watching through live streams and late-night clips, this wasn't just politics. It was vindication. It was proof that their own struggles, their own sacrifices, were not invisible. If Jasmine Crockett could stand here, recognized in the Senate of the United States, then maybe their stories mattered too. The stakes were not just about Crockett's recognition. They were about the broader battle for who gets to define America's heroes. Would it be those who coast on legacy and wealth, or those who fight their way forward, representing millions who will never see the inside of that chamber, but whose lives are shaped by every decision made there? Cory Booker knew the answer. He knew that in telling her story, he was raising the stakes beyond partisan debate. This was no longer about bills or amendments. This was about whose America the Senate would acknowledge, the America of privilege or the America of perseverance. And as his words cut deeper, tension thickened in the chamber. Some senators shifted with unease, while others nodded, aware that history was being recorded in real time. The weight of his speech demanded more than applause. It demanded a reckoning. But before the chamber could fully grasp the depth of his tribute, one question lingered, like a storm cloud forming over Washington. Who were the forces that tried to silence Jasmine Crockett long before she ever set foot in the Senate? What Booker revealed next would answer that question and expose the arrogance that made her rise all the more remarkable. Before Jasmine Crockett's name carried weight in the Senate chamber, before Cory Booker's voice transformed her story into a symbol of resilience, there were those determined to keep her invisible. To understand the power of her journey, one must first confront the arrogance of her detractors, the villains who underestimated her, the institutions that sought to box her in, and the hypocrisy that dripped from their every word. They called her unqualified. They called her unfit. They labeled her passion as anger, her truth as noise, her defense of democracy as grandstanding. These weren't just attacks on her character. They were strategies, carefully sharpened to make her smaller, to reduce her to a caricature. In their eyes, she was never supposed to rise beyond the role they had written for her. A loud voice to be dismissed, a woman of color to be tolerated but never respected. Some of these antagonists sat in the very chamber where Booker now spoke. Men who had coasted into power on legacy and connections sneered when Crockett took the microphone. They mocked her background as a public defender, as if standing up for the voiceless were less honorable than selling out to corporate donors. They smirked when she demanded accountability, hiding their fear of her clarity behind feigned amusement. Others lurked outside the chamber. Media commentators who lived off outrage turned her into a target. Clips of her fiery exchanges were twisted into sound bites, stripped of context, broadcast as proof of incivility. They ignored the substance of her arguments, the evidence she presented, and instead reduced her to a tone, a posture, a stereotype. It wasn't just political, it was personal. It was systemic. And perhaps most dangerous of all were the silent forces, the structures of power that didn't need a shout to suppress, the donor networks that funneled money to her opponents, the lobbyists who whispered that she was too radical, the institutions that claimed to celebrate diversity while quietly ensuring the latter remained out of reach. These were the villains that rarely appeared on camera but left fingerprints on every barrier Crockett had to climb. Yet for all their arrogance, there was one fatal flaw in their campaign against her. They mistook resilience for fragility. They believed that by mocking, dismissing, or starving her campaign of resources, they could break her spirit. Instead, every insult became fuel. Every smirk only sharpened her resolve. Every attempt to silence her amplified her voice. And so, while they congratulated themselves on keeping the chamber safe with their brand of power, Crockett was building something they couldn't see. Credibility rooted in struggle, authority born not of entitlement but of experience. She carried the scars of battles they never had to fight, and those scars became her strength. That was the contrast Cory Booker laid bare in his tribute. On one side, arrogance dressed in expensive suits, clinging to power inherited, unearned, and undeserved. On the other, a woman forged by fire, who turned every dismissal into momentum, every insult into testimony. The antagonists had believed their strategy was working. They thought their whispers had shaped public perception, that their condescension had defined her limits. But the very fact that her story was now echoing in the halls of the Senate was proof of their failure. Because what they never understood was that America's true power does not rest with those who inherit privilege. It rests with those who rise despite the odds, those who transform pain into purpose, and those who refuse to be erased. Jasmine Crockett's presence was living proof of that truth. And as Cory Booker's voice grew steadier, carrying her story across the chamber, the question lingered like a challenge. If these were the forces that tried to keep her out, then what kind of fire must have fueled the woman who made it here anyway? The answer lay not in their arrogance, But in her origin story, the journey of resilience, sacrifice, and service that made Jasmine Crockett uniquely prepared for this moment. And that was the story Booker was about to unveil. Long before Jasmine Crockett's name echoed across the Senate floor, her story was being written in places far from power. She was not born into privilege or groomed for politics. Her journey began in communities where opportunity was scarce, where survival demanded grit, and where justice was not an abstract principle but a daily fight. She carried the lessons of those streets and classrooms into adulthood, where law was not just a career, but a calling. As a public defender, Crockett faced America at its rawest. The broken systems, the overlooked lives, the countless people who couldn't afford a voice in court. While others built resumes on comfort and connections, she built hers on struggle, on stand between power and the powerless. These were not easy years. The hours were long, the victories scarce, and the pay modest. Yet every case added weight to her shoulders and fire to her conviction. She saw families torn apart by injustice, workers punished for speaking out, young men condemned by a system that never gave them a fair chance. And through it all, she refused to back down. It was here, in the crucible of everyday battles, that Crockett's resilience hardened into something unshakable. She wasn't just practicing law. She was preparing for a larger fight, one that would one day carry her into the heart of American power. When she eventually stepped into politics, she brought that same raw fire with her. Critics dismissed her, opponents mocked her, and some colleagues underestimated her. But Crockett's strength was never borrowed from institutions. It was born from lived experience. Every scar from those years in courtrooms and communities became armor. Every victory, no matter how small, was proof that her fight was not in vain. By the time she entered the national stage, she was no longer just an attorney or a politician. She was a vessel for the voices America too often silenced. She had transformed her personal struggles into a mission larger than herself. A mission to prove that representation isn't charity, it's justice. And it was this fire, the one they tried to extinguish, that made Cory Booker's tribute more than a speech. It was a recognition that Crockett's journey had never been about her alone. It had always been about the millions she carried with her. But as the Senate chamber listened in stunned silence, the question wasn't just who Jasmine Crockett was. It was how she would respond when her story collided with those determined to erase it. The chamber had grown restless, its usual rhythm of speeches and scripted exchanges disrupted by a tension that was now impossible to ignore. What began as polite resistance from the antagonist had hardened into open defiance. Arms folded, brows furrowed, whispers spreading like fire. They were no longer dismissing Jasmine Crockett quietly. They were preparing to fight her presence more openly, as though conceding even a fraction of respect would weaken their grip on power. Cory Booker sensed it. He had seen enough debates in this chamber to recognize when lines were being drawn, when rhetoric was slipping into hostility. The more he elevated Crockett, the more the antagonist stiffened. Every nod in her direction, every word honoring her journey, was met with cold glares and murmurs designed to undercut her worth. Crockett, though, remained motionless. She had been underestimated too many times to rise to every insult. Her calm composure contrasted sharply with the agitation across the aisle. It was as if her silence itself had become an act of defiance, each measured breath refusing to yield to their hostility. But the pressure was undeniable. The antagonists, no longer content to hide behind smirks, leaned forward in their chairs, whispering sharp critiques meant to pierce the air. Their unease had transformed into visible irritation, and in that irritation, the stakes climbed higher. The chamber was beginning to resemble not a forum of reason, but a battleground of clashing wills. Booker refused to be rattled. His voice grew stronger, more resolute, shaping each sentence like a challenge hurled across the divide. You can dismiss her fire. You can reduce her to a headline. But every attempt to belittle her only makes her presence more undeniable. A ripple passed through the gallery. Some senators shifted uncomfortably, their postures betraying the tension of the moment. Others leaned in, sensing that something larger was unfolding, something more significant than the usual sparring of politics. The antagonists thought they had cornered Crockett with doubt and mockery, but the very intensity of their resistance revealed how deeply threatened they were. Booker had set the stage, and now the clash was fully visible. The chamber braced itself, because everyone could sense it. The reckoning was coming, and it would strike with more force than any of them expected. The chamber held its breath. Cory Booker had already shifted the atmosphere, but now he prepared to strike with the kind of clarity that could not be ignored. This was no routine defense. This was a dismantling. He steadied his voice, calm but edged with fire. You can call her unqualified. You can dismiss her fire as anger. You can even whisper she does not belong here. But let me tell you, Jasmine Crockett has more America in her scars than some have in their entire careers. The words landed like thunder. Gasps flickered across the room. The antagonist, who once smirked with confidence, now shifted uneasily. Booker had reframed her wounds not as weakness, but as a very evidence of her strength. Silence followed, heavy and deliberate. Booker wielded it like a weapon, forcing the chamber to sit with the truth. And then came the blow. If resilience is anger, then let us all be angry. If demanding justice is incivility, then incivility built this nation. And if belonging here requires the privilege of inheritance, then this chamber has betrayed the very people it claims to serve. The antagonists whispered among themselves, scrambling for reassurance. None came. Their armor of arrogance was cracking. Booker turned toward Crockett. Though his gaze swept the room, it was as if he spoke only to her. Jasmine, your presence here is not charity. It is victory. You forced open doors never meant for you, and now you carry the weight of millions who will never step inside but whose voices echo through you. Her composure held, but her eyes glistened. Senators who rarely betrayed emotion shifted in their seats, uncomfortable at the raw humanity filling the chamber. And then the hypocrisy was laid bare. Booker's voice cut sharper. To those who mock her, let me ask, what storms have you weathered? What sacrifices have you made? I see a woman who rose from grit and justice, while others inherited their seats like heirlooms. So tell me, who truly belongs? The room fell silent. The antagonists stripped of their swagger. Their silence was confession. But Booker was not finished. His cadence climbed, every word pulling the chamber closer. This is bigger than Jasmine Crockett. This is about America, about every child told they weren't enough, every worker ignored, every immigrant who sacrificed everything to call this nation home. She carries them with her. When you dismiss her, you dismiss them. When you mock her, you mock them. And when you try to erase her, you reveal why her presence here is so powerful. And then came the final strike. Booker leaned forward, voice steady but unyielding. So mock her if you must. But know this, you are not mocking weakness. You are mocking America's ability to rise, to endure, to triumph. And history will not remember your smirks. It will remember her story. Silence followed. Pure, unbroken silence. The kind that signaled not victory of one person, but the collapse of an entire pretense. The reckoning had arrived. The silence in the Senate chamber lingered like smoke after a fire. No rebuttal came. No clever retort from the antagonists. They had been stripped bare, their mockery exposed as weakness. But outside those marble walls, the speech was already moving faster than they could contain. Within minutes, staffers were rushing to their phones. Reporters fired off tweets that spread like sparks. Clips of Booker's words were clipped, subtitled, and uploaded before the chamber had even adjourned. The hashtags began to form. Hashtag Crockett belongs. Hashtag Booker defends. Hashtag her story, our story. Social media lit up in waves. College students posted teary-eyed reactions, calling Crockett a symbol of resilience. Workers in break rooms shared the clip, saying she spoke for the overlooked. Parents replayed the moment for their children, urging them to see what courage looked like when power tried to crush it. Even celebrities and cultural figures joined in. A musician tweeted, "That silence after Booker spoke? That was history being made." A best-selling author wrote, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive her mockery. She transformed it into a mirror." The viral momentum grew unstoppable. Meanwhile, in Washington, the ripple hit the media. News outlets scrambled to air the footage. Anchors replayed the lines about scars and resilience, calling them among the most defining words heard in the Senate in years. Commentators debated the fallout. Had Booker just elevated Crockett into a national figure? Had the antagonist inadvertently handed her more power by underestimating her? Inside the chamber, senators who had once hesitated to align themselves with Crockett began to shift. Some who had sat quietly during the speech approached her afterward, voices subdued, offering words of respect. The balance of perception was changing in real time. And for Crockett herself, the moment was seismic. She had walked into the chamber as a target of ridicule, but she was walking out as a symbol of defiance and possibility. Every insult thrown at her had become fuel for a narrative larger than politics, a narrative about who gets to belong in America's most powerful spaces. The antagonists had lost more than an argument. They had lost control of the story. And in politics, losing the story meant losing everything. When the echoes of Booker's words finally settled, the Senate felt different. The marble walls that had so often absorbed empty speeches now seemed to hold something heavier: truth. Jasmine Crockett sat in silence, her composure unbroken, her story now immortalized not by her critics, but by the courage of her resilience. This was no longer about one senator defending another. It was about a universal truth that stretched far beyond Washington. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. For every smirk that tried to diminish her, there were millions watching who saw themselves in her journey. She had become a mirror for those told they didn't belong, a living testament that belonging is not granted by the powerful. It is claimed by the persistent. Booker's voice had reframed the battle in terms no opponent could escape. To mock Crockett was to mock the workers, the immigrants, the children who fight to be seen. To doubt her worth was to doubt the very foundation of America, the idea that grit, not inheritance, defines who deserves a seat at the table. In that truth lay the moral clarity. Greatness is not polished, it is forged. It is built from the scars that others dismiss, from the long nights of struggle, from the resilience that refuses to yield. Crockett's presence, once questioned, now stood as proof that America's promise still lives in those who refuse to be erased. And as viewers replayed the speech, as hashtags turned into movements, one lesson rang out. Power may mock, but dignity endures. Arrogance may shout, but justice speaks louder. In that chamber, history did not bend to the powerful. It bent to the persistent. And so, the Senate witnessed what few expected. A moment where truth rose higher than politics, where Jasmine Crockett's journey became more than her own. It became a story America could not ignore. Cory Booker's tribute did more than honor her. It carved her resilience into the marble of history, reminding the nation that voices born from struggle carry a power no institution can silence. This is why her story matters. Because when dignity is attacked, when arrogance seeks to drown out hope, there must always be someone willing to stand, to speak, to remind us who we are. That's what Booker did. That's what Crockett embodies. And that's what millions across this country felt as they watched. Now the question is, where do we go from here? Do we let this moment pass as just another headline? Or do we carry it forward, turning the spark into a movement that refuses to forget? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, discuss it, keep the conversation alive. Because every time we lift up voices like Jasmine Crockett's, we take one step closer to the America we all deserve.